Well, thank you for coming. My topic is text structure is a key to unlock comprehension. I did an action research project starting in September. In my research question I focused on was how does teaching text structure background knowledge affect students' comprehension for unintroduced text? When I say unintroduced text, I mean our standardized test passages, along with if a student comes to the library and picks up a piece of text that we haven't introduced, how much can they comprehend in that? And can text structure support the lack of background knowledge, specifically for nonfiction text? So my inspiration for research is that I had noted that many fourth graders struggle with the grade level text, not only the anthology, but also our science text and our social studies text, who hadn't struggled in the primary grades. And then in fourth grade, we're really asking them to start reading to learn instead of learning to read. And when we do assess them, we are looking for that comprehension, especially where they start getting grades in science and social studies in fourth grade. And that's it, that really in the content areas, we're asking them to comprehend really heavy text. And I was seeing a lot of students were struggling with that. And then belonging to instructional consultation, I noted that over a 2-year period, that 6 out of the 8 cases that were brought forth from 4th and 5th grade focused on the lack of background knowledge, affecting comprehension. And those of you who are familiar with IC know that in IC, they take a case and they really focus in on what of the 5 main areas of reading does a student struggle on. And again, 6 out of 8 were background knowledge, and that kind of was alarming. If there's probably more of these students, how can I change my teaching to try to help reach these students as a whole class? So I started doing some research, and I found out that Mariotti describes that there are 2 different types of background knowledge that students need to access text. The topic-specific kind, which is the kind that we all teach at the beginning of a Scott Borsman story or when we introduce a text. It's the information, the key concepts, and vocabulary. And then there's text-specific, which is more your text structure, and teaching students how to comprehend text structure in a variety of ways. If we teach students topic-specific, let's say we're reading a story on honeybees, we teach them all about honeybees, we give them all the information they need, they can access that text. But they can't carry that over next week into the story about planets. But if you teach them how the text is set up and how to access and pull out the main information from the structure, they can carry that over to the next week if it's the same structure. A similar study to the one that I conducted was done at Brigham and Young University in 2005. This was done with 3 classes of 2nd graders on expository text. They had a control group which had normal instruction, a content group that had heavy content background knowledge, and a text structure group which really focused on looking at the structure of text. At the conclusion of their study, they found that background knowledge in either form really was imperative for students to comprehend, but that if they did have that text structure background knowledge, they could apply it to other text, and they were very successful. For my research study, I did a 6-week text structure unit in my 4th grade classroom. I was taught in a reading workshop model, and each week I focused on a separate structure. Cause and effect, question answer, main ideas, supporting details, sequence, chronological, and compare and contrast. The way I would teach each structure was on day 1, I would introduce the structure with an anchor text. I would say what the structure was, and I just read a book that followed that structure to the class and kind of just let them think about it. On day 2, we would revisit that anchor book, and I would discuss how the book was arranged, and I would have students pick out, all right, this is cause and effect. Where was the cause and effect? I would show them the graphic organizer we used to organize cause and effect and take notes from cause and effect, and we made an anchor chart to hang in the classroom on the bulletin board, which is still there now. On day 3, I would hand students a passage to read, and this would be done either in pairs or small groups. And they would have to identify the elements of that structure within the text. Then on day 4 and 5, I would reteach from anything I observed from that reading passage, students who needed to be retaught. And also students were encouraged to identify the structure of the week in their own reading, in their self-selected text. They would bring it to the carpet. They would say, this follows cause and effect because here's what I found. I'd photocopy it, we put it on the bulletin board. So we kind of called it our interactive bulletin board, where students were really finding that and putting it up there, and they loved doing that. Now, while I was teaching on this, I really wanted to see how it affected comprehension scores. So to track comprehension, I gave my students 3 kneecap release reading tests. Here you will see that I put up the data, and at the bottom are your percentiles and the number of students who got that percentile. So on January 30th in the beginning is my blue line. You can see that in total I had almost half my students in that 69 or below range, which was kind of alarming. And then in March, about the middle, in February, in the middle of my study in red, you can see the line starting to come up. I have fewer students in that 59 or below. I have more students in the 100 to 90 percentile. And then on January 30th, on March 23rd, I gave the last comprehension passage, which was set up as question answers, so it was a text structure they were familiar with that we had worked with, and it was about covered wagons, and I had 14 students who scored in the 100 to 90 percentile. Wow. And my number of students who was in the 69 or below had dropped down to 3. With doing all this, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just that this passage might have been better, or they did make sure that they understood the text structure that I was teaching. So I gave students a 6-question open-ended survey, one at the beginning of my study, same one at the end of my study. The first 3 questions are really basic, kind of getting them to answer questions. And the last 3 questions went into detail, finding out how they understood text structure. What is text structure? How do authors organize text? What are the different structures? From that, I was able to kind of find a trend and decide if students had no understanding, a weak understanding, some understanding, or a solid. So my pre-survey is in blue, and I had 18 students who had no understanding. They couldn't even tell me what text structure was, which was surprising to me. I knew I had taught it back in December when that skill of the week came up for Scott Porsman, and I knew in the previous years they had taught text structure, but when asked what is text structure, they couldn't recall and put it down on paper. In my post-survey, I had all students had at least a weak understanding. When I say weak understanding, they could tell me text structure is the way we organize text, but they couldn't go into detail. Some understanding, they could give you some details, kind of list the structures, and then a solid understanding. So they could list the structures, tell you why they're important, tell you how they use those structures to get information from text. So by the end, I had 14 students who had a very strong understanding. So my results after all this was that yes, a strong understanding of text structure does improve overall comprehension of unintroduced passages, as proven by the kneecap scores. But a conclusion cannot be made from this study if specific background knowledge can supplement the lack of the topic-specific background knowledge, because I didn't assess their background knowledge on the topics of the kneecap passages, so I can't make that conclusion. And text-specific background knowledge does give students something to connect to, and I had seen that throughout, especially with that last kneecap passage. And when a student understands the text structure of a passage, they can conclude the author's purpose, and when they understand that, they can identify the important concepts and facts from the text. So then, I was doing this in my language arts block, which I do in the afternoon. I started seeing some really interesting stuff in my science block, which is in the first thing. So I had some added benefits to this. That over my 6-week period, and continue to be, students' ability to comprehend science textbooks increased over the study. And those of you who are familiar with our new science books in 4th and 5th grade, that they're set up, with every lesson is set up as a different text structure, but it's just a small little box in the corner under the vocab that the kids can kind of look at. I never really pointed it out, but all of a sudden my students were pointing it out on their own. Hey, look, this is cause and effect. I know it's cause and effect because right here I can see if a magnet does this, then this will happen. And they're really pulling it out, and they were connecting to those concepts. So it was kind of an aha moment to really see that this was being transferred over. And I had noticed my science grades were going up. They were able to write more about the science when I was asked them to write because they could connect. They were understanding those concepts because they could see if it was problem, solution, cause, or an effect. So the next step for this, further research would be necessary to determine if there was a transfer. My observations support this from science, but I didn't formally document it in my study because it kind of just happened. So connecting to the Common Core, we all heard 50% of what students read needs to be nonfiction text. And students can really connect to this nonfiction text and take more away from it if they can identify the structure. So text structure is definitely a way to approach nonfiction text. And the kids really do enjoy it. They enjoy identifying. They feel like little detectives finding the structure, figuring out what did the author choose to write this as? Why did they choose that? Oh, here are the ways I can support that. So my recommendations from this study is that a text structure unit should be taught in the beginning of the year, including teaching the 5 main structures, teacher modeling of the graphic organizers that should be used for each structure to identify the key components, and that students should be encouraged to discover the structures by identifying the organization of the self-selected and bring it up and explaining why it fits that structure. These are some of the sources I used. I want to thank you for coming, and I can take any questions if there are questions.